Alright, this week's project. I've got this old gossip bench. We've actually had this for a while. Felicia picked it up from a thrift store quite some time ago, but I just never had a chance to do anything with it. She's wanted one to set inside by our back door. So what I'm going to do is, while she's busy this week and won't be in the shop, I'm going to redo this for her as a surprise. So this is my first time up close and personal with this piece. I've never paid much attention to it before. It just sat off in the corner. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start just by taking it apart, just pulling it down as much as I can, but to try to make a notes of all the spots that are damaged, things that are broken, and we'll just make a list of everything that needs to be repaired or replaced. So right off the bat, I found this. The skirt at the front, all the scallops have been busted off of them. One end's been completely broken off. So the first thing we're going to do is go ahead and pull this off, pull it apart, because this piece will definitely have to be replaced. After I removed all the skirting, I noticed that the armrest, the back, and all these little spindles were just extremely loose and wobbly. It looked like this thing had been left outside, and I think the wood glue that was been holding everything together has just kind of given up. So I'm just going to go through and drill out these little wooden plugs that they had to hide the screw heads. Start pulling all these screws out. Once I had all the screws out, I just used a scrap piece of wood and a hammer and just worked my way down the armrest, just gently tapping underneath it to break those spindles loose from the bottom. Now that I finally have the armrests and the backrests separated from the seat, there really isn't too much left of this. She's pretty much a shell of her former self. So after removing the clamps, I'm going to go ahead and flip what's left over, and then go ahead and take the rest of that skirting off the bottom. Now that our bench is down to nothing more than 2 parts of a broken seat, I'm going to use a 80 grit sandpaper and get off all of this cracking, flaking, old paint that's on here. And after the first piece is done, I'm going to do the exact same thing to the second piece, except I'm not going to show it. I'm going to go ahead and cut it short because it's sanding and it's boring and no one wants to see that. Alright, now that I got both pieces sanded, I'm going to run them through the surface planer and just take a small amount off each one. I'm thinking of not painting the bench part and leaving it a natural wood, so I want the best surface I can to work with. Now that I got both pieces out of the planer, I noticed they have these little hairline cracks along the edges where it looks like the wood over the years has expanded and contracted and started to separate. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some wood glue and put it over top of these cracks, and then I'm going to take my shop vac and put it up underneath where the cracks are on the bottom side and pull that wood glue down into the cracks. With all the cracks filled in with glue, now it's time to go ahead and put the seat back together. Next, I just took a bunch of clamps and alternated them from top to bottom, from one end to the other, and that will keep equal pressure on both sides and keep it from bowing. And now that our bench seat's all glued up and drying, I'm going to go ahead and take some stripper, and the rest of the pieces will be painted. So I'm going to go through the stripper and to remove as much of this old chipping, flaking paint off as I can and get the surface prepped for paint. With all of our parts stripped, I'm going to jump back to this bench seat, take the clamps off, and I'm going to go over it with a 120 grit sandpaper and then go over it again with a 220 grit. And because no one wants to watch me sit here and sand, I'm just going to fast forward through this part. Even after the sanding, I still had these water marks on the bottom of this bench seat, so I'm going to use some oxalic acid and see if I can wood bleach these stains out, or at least get them so they're not as noticeable. This old desktop was in pretty bad shape. It was split and cracked from being weathered, and I didn't think we could save it. So I took some maple I had laying around my shop and glued it up, and then traced the top out onto that. Now I'm going to just take it over to my bandsaw and cut a new top out for it. Now I know what you're thinking. This is a gossip bench from the 70s, and it really has no value to it. It's not really worth anything. So no, if I was to flip this, I would not be going through all this work that I'm doing on it. But because this is a gift from my wife, I think she's worth the extra effort. In case you didn't notice, I'm kind of struggling making these turns with the bandsaw. The reason being is the blade that's on there is a resaw blade. It's not meant for making curves with it. But I was lazy and I didn't feel like changing the blade out. So I'm just going to leave this one in and just kind of push through it. Okay, now it's time for the paint. I'm using the Bear chalk paint and the color is Eucalyptus Wreath. Normally I spray all of our finishes on. I know you've seen some of my other videos and I'm always spraying everything. But this time I'm using a chalk paint, and usually when our pieces are painted with chalk paint, Felecia is the one that does this. I am not a chalk paint painter. I'm not very good at it. I've never been good at it. But because this is a surprise for her, I'm just going to try my best and figure it out. So, just like the sanding, I'm going to kind of fast forward it through this part. It's just painting and it's really not that interesting to watch. And I'm sure you don't want to see me make a big mess with chalk paint. And with my horrible chalk paint mess drying, I decided to go ahead and remake this new skirt for the front of the bench. I just traced the old skirt out onto a piece of oak, and then I'm going to take it over to the bandsaw and cut it out. As you can see, I've changed the blade out on the bandsaw this time and went with the smaller blade. There was just no way I was going to make those turns with that big thick blade on there. So, laziness out the window, I decided to go ahead and do this the right way. And now we have our new skirt made. Looks a lot better, don't you think, with all the pieces there. Now that we finally have all the pieces made that we're going to need to make, it's time to go ahead and just start putting this thing together. I went ahead and just took some wood glue and just put down to the holes for the spindles. And then using a clamp, I just clamped it down tight to hold it in place until the glue dries. Once I had it the way I wanted it, I just took a damp rag and wiped up all the extra glue that squeezed out from in between the spindles. Once I had all the spindles glued and clamped into place where I wanted them, I took some wood screws and fastened the armrests to the backrests of the bench. Now, using some 1/2-inch dowels and some wood glue, I'm going to plug those screw holes just to kind of hide them. And once they dry, I'm going to use a flush cut saw and just trim them flush with the armrests. Now it's time to start assembling the skirting. Off camera, I used some black Rust-Oleum paint and I went through and spray painted all those corner brackets. I know that you won't be able to see them, but they were pretty rusty, and I figured they could use nice freshening up. And this is what our assembled skirt looks like. Now with the skirting all assembled, I flipped the bench over, and using 1 1/4 inch wood screws, I fastened the skirting back to the bottom of the bench seat. Now, because we had to remake this front skirting, it didn't have the holes drilled in it to attach it to the bottom of the bench seat. So what I did is I took my pocket hole bit and I drilled a pilot hole in the underside of the skirt. It only went in about a 1/2 inch or so, and then took another bit and pre-drilled it for an 1.25" wood screw. Now with all the skirting attached back to the bench, using the original hardware, I went ahead and reattached the legs to the bottom of the bench. And this is what it looks like back in its upright position with the legs on it. Now that we have it assembled for the most part, I'm going to go ahead before we put the desktop in place and go through and finish painting all the spots I hadn't gotten earlier. Well, seeing as Felecia wasn't home, I didn't think she'd mind too much if I snuck into her craft room and borrowed her laser for a few minutes. I came up with this saying that I think will fit both this gossip bench and Felecia perfect. So now I'm back out to the shop with our engraved top in hand, and I'm just going to use some 1-inch wood screws and reattach this top back to the bench. So using some more 1/2-inch dowel, I cut 3 of them into small, like 1/2-inch pieces, and then taking sandpaper, I just rounded the heads off of one end and just made some plugs that resemble pretty much almost identically the ones that were there originally. With all the new plugs in place, I'm just going to use some of our Behr chalk paint and go over these plugs and paint them, and go ahead and add a second coat onto these armrests, and then I'll go around to the back and finish getting the spots I had missed earlier. Alright, before I do the big reveal and show you what I lasered onto this bench top, let's take a look at the piece before we started. And here it is finished. When Felecia got to see this for the first time, she was so excited. She loved the color, and even though she may have to go through and fix a couple of my paint spots, she was ecstatic when she got to read the wording I lasered on the bench top. For her, that really hit home. It just made her love it even more. I hope you all enjoy the way this turned out, and thank you all for watching. We will see you on the next video.